Let me tell you something that most women never figure out, and honestly, it costs them years of their lives. The woman who is the most agreeable, the most flexible, the most go with the flow in the relationship is almost never the woman who gets the most respect. Think about that for a second. We live in a world where women are told from every direction that if you just love him enough, if you just give him enough, if you just don't rock the boat, he will eventually see your value and step up. And I'm here to tell you today that that idea, as well intentioned as it sounds, is one of the most dangerous things a woman can believe when it comes to love. Because here is what actually happens. When you have no boundaries, when you make yourself completely available, completely accommodating, completely open, men don't think, wow, she must really love me. They think she'll tolerate anything. And that is not love. That is a setup for a relationship where you are slowly drained, slowly disrespected, and slowly wondering what went wrong. Welcome back to Love Psychology Secrets, the channel where we go deep, not surface level, on how relationships actually work, what men are really thinking, and how you can build something that is genuinely healthy, genuinely fulfilling, and built on real mutual respect. If you're new here, I want you to hit that subscribe button right now, because every single week we come here and we talk about the things that other channels are afraid to say. And if this kind of content, real relationship psychology, honest love advice, real personal growth, if that speaks to you, go ahead and like this video as we get started. It helps more people find this conversation, and trust me, more people need to hear this. Now let's get into it, because today we are talking about 3 specific boundaries, 3, that when a woman holds them consistently, they fundamentally change how a man sees her. Not because she's playing games, not because she's being difficult, but because she is communicating something to him on a deep psychological level that almost no words can communicate. She is communicating that she knows her own worth. And the honest truth, most men are not consciously aware of this process. It happens beneath the surface, but the effect is unmistakable. Here's the thing people get wrong about boundaries, and I mean almost everyone gets this wrong. People think a boundary is a wall. They think it's a punishment. They think it's a threat you issue when you're angry. If you do that one more time, I'm done. And look, I understand why people think that, because that's how boundaries are usually talked about. But that framing is fundamentally backwards, and it's the reason so many women set boundaries that completely fall apart within a week. A real boundary is not a reaction. It is not something you declare in the heat of an argument. A real boundary is a standard, a quiet, consistent, non-negotiable standard for how you allow yourself to be treated. And the woman who holds real boundaries doesn't even have to raise her voice. She doesn't have to threaten. She doesn't have to explain herself for 20 minutes. She simply behaves in alignment with what she values, and she does it consistently. That consistency is what men feel. That consistency is what creates respect. Think about it this way. You walk into a restaurant and the menu has prices. You don't negotiate the prices. You don't argue with the menu. The prices are simply what they are. And if you want the experience, you pay the price. Now imagine a restaurant that kept changing its prices based on how hungry you looked, or how much you pushed back, or whether you were having a good day. Would you respect that restaurant? Would you trust it? No. You'd probably take advantage of it. The same psychology applies in relationships. And I'm not talking about men being predatory. I'm talking about a fundamental human truth. We respect what holds its standard. We devalue what doesn't. And here is the part that most women find genuinely surprising when I explain it. Men don't respect you less because you have boundaries. Men, the ones worth keeping, respect you more. The ones who don't, the ones who get irritated, who push back hard, who make you feel guilty for having a standard. That reaction is actually telling you something extremely important about the man you're dealing with. We'll come back to that. But right now, let's break this down. I want to walk you through 3 boundaries, 3 specific, practical, deeply psychological boundaries that make a real difference in how a man relates to you over time. And for each one, I want to tell you not just what the boundary is, but why it works, what it communicates, and how to actually hold it in a way that doesn't feel forced or dramatic. All right? Let's go. The first boundary is this: your time has value, and you protect it accordingly. Now, I know that sounds almost too simple, too obvious, but listen to me, because most women are violating this boundary constantly without even realizing it. And they're doing it not out of weakness, but out of love. They cancel their plans for him. They rearrange their schedule around his uncertainty. They sit available, waiting for him to confirm while their own life sits on pause. And I understand why. When you care about someone, you want to show it. You want to be there. You want to be flexible. That impulse comes from a genuine place. But here's what that behavior actually communicates. It tells him that your time is infinitely flexible, that your schedule bends for him, that the things you were going to do, the plans, the commitments, the life you were building before he came along, all of that is secondary to his availability. And over time, even a good man will start to unconsciously operate from that assumption. He'll give you less notice. He'll be less consistent, not because he's a bad person, but because you've taught him through your actions, not your words, that he doesn't need to be. I was talking to a woman recently, and she came to me genuinely confused. She said, I do everything for this man. I'm always available. I never say no. And somehow he still doesn't seem to value my time. And I asked her one question. I said, when was the last time he had to wait for you? She went quiet because the answer was never. He had never once had to wonder if she'd be available. He had never had to plan ahead to secure time with her. She was just always there, always waiting, always open. And here's what I want you to understand. I am not telling you to play games. I'm not saying manufacture fake plans to make him chase you. That kind of manipulation backfires and it's beneath you. What I'm telling you is to actually live your life fully, richly on your own terms. When you have plans, keep them. When he asks to see you at the last minute, let your actual schedule answer for you. Not as a strategy, as a reality. Because you are a woman with a life, with priorities, with people who depend on you and count on you. And that life does not stop simply because a man became interested in you. Think about what happens in a professional context. When you try to get a meeting with someone who is genuinely busy, genuinely in demand, what happens? You respect their calendar. You plan ahead. You feel a certain weight to the interaction because you know their time is not infinite. Now contrast that with someone who always has an open door, who is always available whenever you want to drop by. You appreciate the access, sure, but do you value the interaction the same way? Of course not. The same psychology operates in relationships, whether we want to admit it or not. And here's the part that matters most. When you start protecting your time, not as a game, but as a genuine reflection of your own self-worth. Something interesting happens with men who are serious about you. They rise to meet it. They start planning ahead. They stop assuming and start securing time with you because they've learned through your quiet consistency that your time is not guaranteed, that it has to be earned and planned for. And that shift in his behavior is one of the earliest and clearest signs that a man genuinely values you. The men who don't rise, the men who get annoyed that you weren't available at a moment's notice, who sulk when you kept your plans, you've learned something invaluable about them. You've learned how they would treat your time in a long-term relationship, and it is not good. Now, here's where it gets interesting, because the second boundary we're talking about today is less talked about than the first. But in some ways, it's even more fundamental. The second boundary is this: your emotional peace is not available for disruption. Let me explain what I mean by that, because this one is subtle. Most people, when they think about emotional boundaries, they think about not letting someone yell at you or call you names. And yes, obviously that's part of it, but that's the extreme version. The much more common version, the one that slowly erodes a relationship over months and years, is something quieter. It's the emotional chaos that some people, and some men specifically, introduce into a relationship not through cruelty, but through inconsistency, through hot and cold behavior, through the cycle of pulling you close and then pulling away, through picking arguments over nothing, creating tension, and then acting like you're the problem for feeling unsettled. And the women who get caught in these patterns, I've spoken to so many of them, they don't describe it as abuse. They describe it as exhausting. They say things like, I never know where I stand with him. Or 1 week he's amazing, and then the next week he's cold and I don't know what I did. Or I feel like I'm always walking on eggshells. Does any of that sound familiar? Here's what's happening underneath the surface in those dynamics. The man, consciously or not, has learned that the woman's emotional state is directly and immediately responsive to his. Meaning, when he's warm, she's warm. When he's cold, she becomes anxious. When he creates tension, she chases the resolution. And as long as that dynamic exists, as long as her emotional stability is dependent on his behavior, she is not holding an emotional boundary. She has handed him the remote control to her internal state. Now, I want to be careful here because I'm not talking about being cold or detached. Real emotional warmth and generosity are beautiful qualities in a woman and in a man. We're not trying to build walls. We are not trying to become emotionally unavailable ourselves. What we're talking about is something very different. It's the ability to feel his energy without being controlled by it. It's the ability to notice that he's in a mood and not immediately make that mood your emergency. It's the ability to be centered in your own peace while still being caring and connected. I think about this the way I think about the ocean. A storm can happen on the surface of the ocean. Waves crash, wind blows, things get turbulent. But go deep enough and the ocean is still. That stillness at the bottom doesn't mean the storm isn't real. It doesn't mean the ocean doesn't feel it. It just means that the storm doesn't control the entire body of water. That's the kind of emotional groundedness we're talking about. Storms can pass over you. They don't have to claim you. Practical example. He comes home or he texts you in a bad mood. Short, cold, distant. In the past, maybe you'd immediately start analyzing what you did wrong. Maybe you'd reach out, try to fix it, try to bring him back to warmth. And what often happens in those moments? The more you chase the warmth, the colder he gets, because now you're chasing. And nobody, male or female, respects what chases them into a bad mood. Instead, and this is the boundary, you allow him his mood. You don't take it personally, you give it space. You remain grounded in your own peace. Maybe you say warmly, I can see you've got a lot going on. I'm here when you want to talk. And then you go back to your own evening, your own book, your own call with a friend, your own thing. And what often happens, not always, but often, is that the man comes out of his own mood on his own timeline and he comes to you. And now the dynamic is completely different. Because here's what that quiet groundedness communicates to him on a psychological level. It says, I am not destabilized by your fluctuations. I care about you, but I am not dependent on your mood to function. My peace is mine. And men, and I mean men who are capable of healthy relationships, find that extraordinarily attractive. Not the coldness, not the withdrawal, the groundedness. The woman who is comfortable in her own skin, regardless of what's happening around her. And that groundedness, that emotional self-possession, it actually makes him feel safer with you over time. Because he knows that when he's struggling, he doesn't have to perform. He doesn't have to manage your reaction on top of managing his own stress. He can actually come to you. And that's what creates deep, lasting intimacy. Not the woman who reacts most intensely to everything he does, but the woman who remains a stable, grounded, loving presence even in the middle of uncertainty. Now let's talk about how this plays out when it's more serious. Because sometimes it's not just a bad mood. Sometimes you are dealing with a man who is genuinely inconsistent, who genuinely runs hot and cold, who genuinely uses emotional distance as a way of controlling the dynamic. And in those situations, the boundary looks like this. You name what you observe, calmly and without drama. You say something like, I've noticed that when things feel uncertain between us, I tend to go looking for reassurance, and I don't want to do that anymore. I'm grounded in who I am and what I bring to this relationship, but I need the consistency to be real, not just there when it's convenient. That's a boundary. That's not a threat. That is a woman declaring that her emotional peace is not a revolving door. Some men hear that and they step up. They realize they've been careless and they do the work. And some men don't. And again, the response tells you everything about what you're working with. Let me transition now to the third boundary. And I want to say up front, this one is the most misunderstood of all three. Because on the surface, it sounds like a small thing. But underneath it, it is the foundation of every genuinely respectful relationship I have ever observed or studied. The third boundary is this. You do not participate in your own diminishment. Say it again. You do not participate in your own diminishment. What does that mean? Let me break it down. Diminishment in a relationship doesn't always look like insults. It doesn't always look like someone calling you names or belittling you openly. Most of the time, it's much more subtle than that. It's the backhanded comment that's delivered as a joke. It's the eye roll when you share something you're excited about. It's the way he talks over you in front of others, or contradicts you publicly, or subtly implies that your feelings are overreactions. It's being talked to in a tone that you would never use with someone you respect. And here's the pattern I see most often. A woman notices it. She feels it. Something inside her registers that wasn't okay, but she doesn't say anything. Maybe because she doesn't want to start a fight. Maybe because she's afraid of being called too sensitive. Maybe because she's so committed to keeping the peace, to being the understanding one, to being the one who doesn't make things difficult. And so she absorbs it. She lets it pass. And she tells herself it's not a big deal. But here's what actually happens when you let those moments pass consistently. Two things actually. First, the behavior gets repeated and usually escalates because nothing told him it was not okay. And second, something in you begins to quietly collapse. Not dramatically, not all at once, but slowly, the accumulation of absorbed moments, of swallowed reactions, of dismissed feelings begins to erode your own sense of self-worth inside that relationship. Until one day you look up and you don't quite recognize who you've become. You've gotten so used to shrinking that shrinking feels normal. I talked to someone, I'll change the details for privacy, but the core of the story was this. She was with a man for 3 years. By most external measures, the relationship looked fine. But she told me that in those 3 years, she had stopped sharing her opinions on things they disagreed about. She had stopped talking about her career ambitions because he always found a way to redirect the conversation back to himself. She had stopped inviting friends around because he made comments that embarrassed her afterward. And she said, I don't even know when it started. I just know that somewhere along the way, I started making myself smaller so there'd be less for him to push back on. That is a woman who lost the third boundary. And regaining it is not as simple as just deciding to speak up one day. It requires a genuine reckoning. A moment of honesty with yourself where you ask, have I been participating in my own diminishment? And if the answer is yes, what needs to change? Because here's the thing, you cannot demand respect. You cannot argue someone into treating you well. But you can refuse to model the behavior that tells them it's acceptable not to. And the way you do that, the way you hold this third boundary is by responding in real time. Not with anger, not with drama, with calm, clear, unambiguous communication. In the moment when something diminishing happens, you address it. Not 3 days later, not in a long text message at midnight, in the moment. Something as simple and direct as, hey, that comment didn't land well. That's not how I want to be spoken to. Or, I don't think you meant that to come out the way it did, but it didn't feel good. Let's try that again. That's it. No 15-minute lecture, no tearful explanation of why it hurt, just a clear, grounded statement that says, that is not how we speak to each other here. And then, this is crucial, you observe what happens. Because a man who genuinely respects you will pause. He will take that seriously. He might get a little defensive in the moment, that's human, but he'll come back around. He'll apologize. He'll be more careful because he cares about how his behavior lands. The man who doubles down, who turns it on you, who says you're too sensitive or you always make a big deal out of nothing, he is showing you that your comfort is not his concern. That is not a man who will treat you better over time. That is a man who will treat you worse because you've just shown him that you'll call it out and he doesn't like that. And I want to say this very directly because it needs to be said. Holding this boundary is not about being difficult. It is not about being high maintenance. It is not about nitpicking every imperfect sentence your partner says. People communicate imperfectly. Relationships are messy and real. The goal is not perfection. The goal is a consistent pattern of mutual respect where both of you feel safe to speak, feel heard, feel valued. And when a moment breaks that pattern, the boundary is what brings it back quietly, consistently, without making it a crisis. Now, here's where I want to bring all three of these boundaries together because there's something that connects them underneath, a theme that I don't think gets talked about enough. All three of these boundaries, protecting your time, protecting your emotional peace, refusing to participate in your own diminishment, all three of them are really expressions of the same thing. They're expressions of self-respect. And self-respect in a relationship is not a wall between you and your partner. It is the foundation that makes real closeness possible. Here's why. When a woman doesn't respect her own time, she teaches him to be careless with it. When a woman doesn't protect her own peace, she creates a dynamic where his mood controls the entire relationship. When a woman participates in her own diminishment, she slowly trains him to see her as someone who can be reduced. And what happens to love in those conditions? It gets complicated. It gets resentful. Because love cannot fully flourish in an environment where one person is progressively losing themselves. But the reverse is equally true. When a woman holds these standards consistently, not harshly, not dramatically, but quietly and firmly, something happens to the way a man relates to her. He starts to see her differently. Not as someone to manage or take for granted, but as someone to consider, to think about, to be genuinely present with. Because her expectations are clear, her self-worth is evident, and being with her requires him to show up. And when a man is with a woman who requires him to show up, a man who is capable of a real relationship, he does. And he's better for it. I want to say something about men here too, because this channel is about both sides of the equation. Men, at least the ones who are doing the inner work, are not looking for women they can push around. They might test boundaries, consciously or not. They might push to see where the edges are, but they're not hoping to find no edges at all. The men who want to be with a woman they genuinely respect, they need to feel that respect is the correct response. They need to encounter a woman who holds something worth respecting. And a woman without standards, a woman who bends entirely to his preferences, who abandons herself piece by piece in the name of keeping the peace. That woman, however beautiful and loving she is, does not inspire lasting respect. She may inspire fondness, she may inspire appreciation, but deep bone level respect, that requires a woman who is fully, unapologetically herself. If this video gave you something real today, if it made you think, made you feel seen, or gave you something you plan to actually use, hit that like button. It takes 1 second and it tells YouTube to put this in front of someone who needs it. And if you haven't subscribed yet, now's the time. We come here every week and we go deep on love, on relationships, on the psychology of how humans connect and sometimes lose each other. You don't want to miss what's coming next.